And as soon as it hits, there we go. Now, hello, and the magic light bulb, and the clickety-clacks, and all the little tiny thingies, and we have no sound, so all you get to do is to hear me say, "Troubles in Paradise," and here I am, RJ Downard, the guy that's trying to destroy one source at a time. And there's my fancy little logo image. Whoops. And that ended before I was talking about it. Anyway, hello, welcome to the Evolution Hour, where I'm doing my part to destroy creationism, one source at a time. I was gifted a book by a follower who said, hey, I'm not interested in reading this crap, but I'll buy it and send it to you if you'd like to do something on it. And I said, yeah, Contested Bones. This is a brand new, hot off the press 2017 book by Christopher Rupe and John Sanford. And those of you who know of John Sanford, he's a wackaloon creationist geneticist who has written the genetic entropy thing, where Pelagia sent me the PDF of it finally, and I was able to discover, oh, this is a thin book. This is not nearly as monumental as I was expecting it to be, given how it's used. So I was kind of curious to see this because it was on fossils, and I was hoping so bad that it was going to go into the full fossil record, and so I'd hear what they had to say about the Cambrian explosion and the reptile-mammal transition or not. But no, it's just about human evolution exclusively. So that was kind of a semi-disappointment for me, but I realized that it was a perfect opportunity to be able to display source methods analysis for everybody to see literally on the fly as I analyze a book from the start to the finish. And the first order of business that I did, whenever you get a brand new book, and it doesn't matter whether it's a science book or not, you're going to look beyond just the obvious table of contentsy stuff, which you get up in the front, and then you would be looking at kind of glancing through to see, oh, there's pictures I could see, and there's a lot of text, and it's got footnotes in the bottom, and so there's some little excerpts from things, New Scientist and that, where they're riffing off of material. That's expected, but where you really want to get at the business end is at the back of the book first. And what did I find in the back of the book? But just picture credits. There's no index. There's no index. How the hell are you going to find out what the content of the book is on a particular subject matter without an index? How can people purporting to be writing a science-oriented book, even for a creationist audience, get away without an index? Apparently this FSM Foundation, or FMS Foundation, which is not false memory syndrome, apparently, it's a group that I can't find out who published this thing. It's probably a self-published-y kind of thing. And that explains why it's done less sophisticated than I did through CreateSpace when I did Slam Dunk, which I made an index for mine thing. And it doesn't have a bibliography either. And as all those of you who know me know, that's a big no-no. So what I've done on this, for this kind of analysis, is to do something that I'd never done for a specific book before. I have generated a bit before. And that of Jonathan Wells in particular, and Philip Johnson didn't have a bibliography in their book. So I went ahead and constructed one. So I'm doing exactly the same thing on this one with a new twist. Let me do my little, again, to show you what's peeking along in my head here. Oh, I better take a note about our little crowd out in the other room here. Brian Stevens says, a full fossil record be volumes and volumes if looked at from geological standpoint alone. You got it. I'll keep an eye on all of the comments along the line here, but I'll be focusing a little more. So what you should be seeing on your screen at the moment is the first bit of the notes that have been done in Rupe and Sanford so far in like the first 20 pages. And it's about one source per page. I'm pulling the stuff. I put little notes over here as to what page he's citing them, because remember, he doesn't have a bloody index. And in some cases, they're miscellaneous books like this Campbell and Reese biology book that I don't have in my bibliography, and I take a little note of it. The other stuff that I do have in my bibliography, I do know. I'll be mentioning Niles Eldridge and Ian Tattersall's The Myths of Human Evolution. It has to do with a quote mine that they latch onto, and I've got a link in the comment section, the description section of this video that will link you to that. And this Haile Selassie article was one that they didn't actually directly cite, at least not yet, but all they've done is draw off of Haile Selassie's press release on it. And then we've got this one where I did put a link up, McBrearty and Jablonski, 2005, on the first fossil chimpanzee. That's what I'm going to be discussing, because that was the first technical work, and this Johansen and Eadie book down below, we'll be getting to that in a moment. This is source methods in a nutshell. On a particular page, then, they had this little passage here where they were citing that McBrearty article. And in almost all the cases, another thing that I've done here is to do a spreadsheet analysis, which is a comparable format to what I was doing in the Big Tip project, but I've never done it for a specific book before. And that's a breakdown of its source analysis. So as I put the source in, there's McBrearty and Jablonski. It's a technical paper. So far, they've only cited 3 actual technical works. They've got 17 secondary coverages. Some of them are by scientists, some of them are not. There's no general yet. There's one creationist that he's cited for an authority quote, Lubenow. And then this little over here, the authority quote pile. In other words, was a source cited for its content or just for an authority quote that they're riffing off of? And I'm putting all of that stuff in orange plus a few little other minor ones. You'll notice that how much orange there is around here. That's because all of it, for all practical purposes, 86% so far, is just authority quoting. And then I have a further breakdown where I'm looking into chronology because I'm curious to see how recent the work is. At the moment, they've got quite a chunk from the 21st century, at least. We'll see how that fleshes out. I'm expecting them to kind of hold off on that and hold up pretty well. But the very first technical paper they cite is on the chimpanzee genome. And here's the context. So I typed out what the text was. Bernard Wood, a leading paleo expert at George Washington University, acknowledges that not everyone in the field agrees with the ever-growing taxonomical distinctions. ... Critics of the bushy family tree have charged that paleoanthropologists have been overzealous in identifying new species from their finds, presumably out of a desire for fame and further research funding. And this was note 9 to Wood's the Scientific American article, which the authors misrepresented as 2016 when it was in fact 2014. That's already starting to think that maybe they're getting this from a quote mine. We'll get back to that quote in a bit. Then they went on, perhaps this explains why so many ancient bones are claimed to be in the human lineage, while only one bone has been attributed to the chimp lineage. And then they note McBrearty paper 2005, as Donald Johansen, discoverer of Lucy, confesses, in everybody who is looking for hominids, there is a strong urge to learn more about where the human line started. Note 11 is to Johansen and Eadie. Now, the reason why I was focusing so much on this was, is the paleontology issue of how you find fossils and what gets preserved or not. And as it turns out, which is where I put this other quote, I was already familiar with this chimpanzee issue because Johansen and Eadie, 1981, literally the very source that they cite next, pointed out that tropical forests do not preserve them. The soil is too acid. Bones are eaten away by that acid and by bacteria before they begin to undergo the slow process of fossilization. So right off the bat, they're overlooking information. I suspect it's because Rupe, the co-author, was the guy that did all the foot traffic. Sanford, who's not a paleoanthropologist, declares in his opening section that he's basically relied on Rupe to do all of the basic science research on paleoanthropology. This may have been a mistake. And so we've got this matter about the McBrearty article. What was it about? Well, for the once, they've actually found some chimpanzee fossil, or rather teeth. That's what was preserved. Teeth are really durable, and it takes a hell of a lot to disintegrate them. That's why most of the mammal fossil record is known just by teeth. But chimpanzee teeth are really, really distinctive, and they were able to identify them as a chimpanzee lineage, not a hominid lineage. So the idea is, and it also was showing that chimpanzees were living outside of the range of the normal environment that they live in now, so that was a paleogeographical thing, that they were much broader. So we've got the fact that McBrearty is delivering a perfectly fine technical paper that relates to the circumstances of what was found and why these were legitimately chimpanzee, and that the paleoanthropology of why things are identified as a human ancestor, a hominid, isn't willy-nilly. It's based upon rigorous analysis and rigorous systematics, which so far in these first 20 pages, the authors have shown absolutely no interest in dealing with. I'll go down below then to that quote that we had from Wood, an article that wasn't in the right date. Here's the whole quotation in context, and I put in black, bold, the section that they decided to quote. that they're talking about how the bushiness of animals in general is much more recognized now. That the older view that Wood was trying to fight was this single species model of the old view that really dates back into the early 20th century. The idea that a species A turns into species B, A is gone, B then turns into C, B is gone, as opposed to A branching out and forming a B, which continues persistent with A and B exist, and B fissions off into a C, and A fissions off to a D, and A and B and C are all running at the same time, and some of the lineages survive and others not. That's how actual animal systems tend to work in real life, and that's what they suspect is happening in these other areas. And he made a perfectly fine point about why his prejudice is that we are most likely dealing with a real phenomenon. There are sound, logical reasons to suspect that the fossil record always underestimates the number of species and so forth. And what I linked to in the main description was the section on the technical paper that he wrote from actually 2016, not 2014, that goes into the details of why they are favoring a bushier model of the scientific data. Kids, we're about a quarter of the way through the show, and I've dithered on explaining the opening salvos of my analysis of the Sanford book. Would the Pug or Jackson care to make a comment upon that?
Well, first of all, it is painfully obvious that they do not regularly deal in paleontological data, because they clearly don't understand taphonomy at all. They don't understand how to look at the different characters of these fossils and determine, hey, is this more like a chimpanzee or is this more like a human or anything like that? And they are just ignoring sources that will tell them how to do it, intentionally or otherwise. But I kind of saw the same thing in the video I did recently. They just flat out ignore a huge swath of data that they could be using to better inform their arguments. And you'd think people who claim to be on the right side of arguments would incorporate all the data instead of leaving a substantial portion out of it.
Yeah, and that's where the source methods analysis is so beautifully useful. Never trust a pseudoscientist to fairly cite a source. Always, if you can look them up, look it up and find out what the actual content is, because they're playing fast and loose with the fiddly bits on there. I noted that you mentioned taphonomy, and that's not maybe a word in everybody's common lexicon, so I put a little definition of it in there. It's the science of how fossils get to be dead and preserved the way they are. And it's a huge discipline of where you can figure out why bits and pieces of an animal get preserved but not the rest, why skulls in a particular case might be preserved, why we have so many triceratops skulls and not most body fossils, why teeth get preserved relatively easily, why sharks are known primarily by their teeth, not by their body. They're made of cartilage, it disintegrates. So there's all sorts of reasons why things occur the way they are. And taphonomy is an area that you would think would be right up the alley of young Earth creationists, because they've got the granddaddy of all taphonomy sources, the flood. And therefore, the taphonomy of a deposit would be dead giveaways of rapid catastrophic deposition as an absolute ubiquitous phenomenon globally. But it isn't. And once in a while, you get a perfectly normal style disaster, like a pyroclastic flow or a nice flood wash that you get from tidal waves and things like that. Happens once in a while. But the vast majority of the fossil record isn't that. Most things aren't full bodies. They aren't preserved in great detail. They're little bits and pieces of stuff. And the reasons why the bits and pieces get to be where they are, why we don't have any things from chimpanzees except for a couple teeth and maybe some problematic bones otherwise, is all related to that. And when you look at any source, a regular science source or a popular a generic book by a scientist or a wackaloon book or anything else, no matter how sciencey it looks, you're going to be able to find out whether they've got their head up their ass or not if you start looking at it from the source methods direction, when you look at what their documentation is. And don't take people's word for it. This is something that if you read a regular science book, you'll find that every time you check out the source data, it's confirming and reinforcing and being played fairly. You'll see the science method. You'll say, yeah, they said this meant that, and that's what it is, and there's no information in there that contradicts that viewpoint and that it is relevant that they left out. And that you'll find as a rigorous thing in real scientists, and it's going to be missing constantly when you try to source check, no matter how many footnotes they may have. At the moment, they're averaging one source per page. And we'll find out whether or not that picks up. If the book is 300 some odd pages long.
You say
Yeah,
one
jump in.
source per page?
Yeah, I'm on page 21, and I've got 21 sources so far.
Holy crap.
Yeah, you remember my book?
Yeah. They must make only one.
I've got 2,300 sources in a roughly 400 pages of text. So you can do the math. You've got 5 sources per page average.
Yeah. Wow.
And they're technical largely. So there's a completely different frame of it. So when I saw what was going on, I thought, okay, I'm going to do this as an analysis. I've done full source analyses at the documentation level for like Michael Denton. When I did Denton's book for Slam Dunk, I went through and cataloged and tracked down every single primary source technical citation that he uses in the entire book. I didn't do a bibliography because he didn't do a bibliography, but I didn't need to. The vast majority of his technical literature, and I didn't really need to know how many he'd cited or anything like that. But this one being written by a full-blown creationist and relatively sparse means I thought it would be useful to do a complete breakdown analysis of what was being cited, what it was being cited for, how old they were, and all that kind of stuff. And so far, at least, we're getting a pile up of authority quotes. Now, there are obvious issues that are going to come up. Another issue that I'm keeping as a little question mark is, do they ever mention chronology? Several of the charts they copy happen to have bands along the side that have the standard chronological frame. But Sanford's a young Earth creationist, and I guess Rupe is too. I would be surprised if he had done. I can't find out a damn thing about this Rupe guy. He has no other paper trail. Rupe didn't show up at all. He's a biologist, doesn't seem to have any paper trail, isn't showing up as published in anything. So what his CVs are, I don't know. He just is invisible. I may stumble upon more information later on as I poke around on stuff. Sanford, of course, has a paper trail. He is a geneticist for real, not a terribly innovative one, and he has access to grind, and he's a young Earth creationist. The one way you can measure this is if they get published at Answers in Genesis or ICR. Because they are the purest of pure. They do not print anybody that doesn't abide by the complete young Earth creationist package, because they regard everybody else as apostates. So for Sanford to show up on that venue instantly identifies him as a young Earth creationist. Well, if he is, why not tell it? If you're going to present a young Earth creationist model of paleoanthropology, go ahead and do it. So I'm going to be waiting to see if they discuss how these things got preserved in the flood. What's the paleochronology relating to the Tower of Babel and all of these little things. And if they want to do that, fine. I don't see any signs of it in my first glance through the book, and I suspect it's hide the ball, that they don't actually have. Remember, that's the third problem of pseudoscience failure. It's the inability to work out what they think happened, the map of time problem. And so I'm expecting them to be entirely carping at the evolutionary position, but not really telling you what they think happened. And then the other bit is, are they going to cite any creationists? We know the baraminologists have weighed in on Australopithecines. Todd Wood and all the rest have done technical papers on them in their creationist literature. Are they going to avoid them? Don't they count? Don't they think they're sciencey enough? They aren't, but nevertheless, shouldn't they think they're sciencey enough? And so I'll be very curious to see to what extent he even ignores his own side, which is also going to be a dead giveaway. But without an index and without a bibliography, it's hard to spot that until I go through page by page by page by page by page.
Oh, we lost Jackson.
Oh, we lost God. Well, then it's up to you, Pug.
Oh, all right.
Say something.
Actually, I just it may be a little early on in the process for this question, but your impression so far, are you thinking carelessness or dishonesty with what you've read so far?
Oh, that's a good question. I think carelessness mixed with an ideological mandate. Because if I've read enough creationists who have a bee in their bonnet about anti-evolution, that they're hunting for authority quotes. They live by authority quotes. They're addicted to authority quotes. 95% of anti-evolutionists are source addicts. They simply copy somebody else's argument. So what this guy does, Sanford, by definition, is relying on Rupe for his research. And Rupe, outside of his own field, is venturing into a technical area. And what does he come up with? A bunch of authority quotes, and doesn't seem to be detailing their own position. So they haven't thought that through. Now, I'll be testing out this model as I go farther along. As I plug in the sources, the spreadsheet will automatically calculate all the things I don't have to bother about. All I got to do is plop them in the right category. And then I'll also be looking to see, Jackson's back. Jackson, you were hit by lightning or something down there in Louisiana?
Oh, I was on my phone. I changed to my computer.
Things like that can happen. Yeah, I will still marvel at the fact that we're doing this at all, that I'm able to communicate with people in Louisiana and New Jersey instantaneously on video, where people can see my mug, and all of that's being done effortlessly. I mean, that's an amazing thing. But it also means that just as I've been able to find the primary sources on this stuff, everybody can do it. And therefore, what the hell was preventing Rupe? Did Rupe even bother to read all of Edie on Johansson's book before he decided to jump on the bandwagon and announce that chimpanzees weren't really important because they weren't looking for them because they're not on the human lineage? No, it's a taphonomy issue. So I suspect that issue after issue after issue are going to be dealt with in this way, but I'll find that out as I go. And so it's going to be an ongoing series I'll be doing. The bibliography will get bigger. The spreadsheet will get bigger, probably not gigantically so. And I'll be looking for examples when not authority quoting, but when they actually discuss a data point, do they get the data point right? So far, it's 0 for 1. The one time they actually brought up a technical point, which is the preservation of chimpanzees, they screwed up. And we'll see whether or not they follow it all the way down the line, because they got a lot of data. I know I can see the outlines of what they're going to be pointing out. They're going to be God of the Gapsing like mad. We don't have a clear picture of how the transition from Australopithecines to early Homo genus took place, because we have relatively little fossils. Even Homo habilis is relatively fragmentary. We don't have full body skeletons for a lot of this stuff. Although we do have brains, we have brain endocasts. That's another piece of information I'm going to see if they mention. Are they going to talk about the brain endocasts of Homo habilis? We know that different brain cells bulge up and make little marks in the skull. And so even though the brain isn't preserved, you got the skull. And if you have a well-preserved skull, you can tell from the little ripples and stuff on it what brain things are there and convolutions by inference. And Wernicke's area and Brokaw's area, which are brain systems we use for speaking language, are present in Homo habilis. Whether they were using them for language, we don't know. We don't have any Homo habilis. We can't get the time machine and go back 2.5 million years to ask them. But the idea that language systems are developing slowly and incrementally, and interconnections are being made that eventually become fully grammatical language systems that we have in our species, and probably in Neanderthals, but we don't have any Neanderthals to ask either, even though we got chunks of DNA knocking around in us from them, so we boinked. And I would imagine that, I can envisage that they were communicating back and forth, at some more complicated level. So it's highly likely, in my view, that Neanderthals had some form of language. And there's an inferential argument to be made in tool making, that to teach how to make tools, to convey to somebody how to envisage what was inside the stone, which indeed everybody who's tried to replicate the early tools that were being done by Homo erectus back 1 million years ago, to recreate that stuff means you have to imagine what the tool looks like from the rock before you hit it, to know where you're going to flake, to be able to get the tool out that you need for your blade. And you have to envisage that in the same way that Leonardo da Vinci was Michelangelo was envisaging the statue inside the block of marble before he starts cutting. And so that he doesn't make mistakes and knock off parts. The diamond cutter has to do exactly the same thing. So there's a circumstantial argument that sophisticated conceptualization dates way back to Homo erectus, before our own species. And I suspect some language needed to be involved in the teaching process there. But we don't know. We don't have a time machine. Reactions? Comments? Silence?
We haven't heard anything from Sai yet.
Well, he said a little. He asked me a question, which I answered, that I thought my initial impression of the book while you were vaporized.
Well, I missed it.
My initial impression of the book was that they were being dishonest or sloppy, and I'll go with the sloppy. That it's much more likely that's the case. There may be instances down the road when there is such a tactical omission of primary source data that you got to go, whoa, wait a minute.
I have to say, I'm interested to know whether or not Sanford agrees with Wood's conclusion that A. Sadiba is a member of the human holobarmen.
Yeah, I'll bet he doesn't even mention it. When I get down to the final section and find out who gets sorted, I suspect he ain't going to cite any creationist baramenology at all, but we'll find out. That's one of the little interesting things, because if you believe your own side, shouldn't you use your own side and make use of that as a theoretical model? But of course, lumping A. Sadiba in with the Homo genus, for those of you who are aware of that, Jackson did a wonderful video on the analysis of creationists misrepresenting all of this stuff and dancing around. The baramenology movement is something everybody who really can't stand creationism should really dive in and read baramenology papers, because they are a hoot. They're trying so hard. I have no doubt whatsoever that Wood and Kavanaugh and all the ones, Aaron even, that did the thing on this Cassiid family and the reptile mammal transition, they want to be sciencey. They're trying to be sciencey. They're just doing it really badly. They're skipping past stuff, and you can see them bypassing around data stream until they can get something that they can feel comfortable with. And so little of it's done. You know, when you compare the mountain of material that spews out on cladistic systematics, cladism is the analytical tool that's just everybody in paleontology has been using it for the last 20, 30 years. It's the super kit, because it's how you analyze taxonomical bit and figure out what is a plausible relationship. It doesn't have any evolutionary assumptions in it. It's only an analytical tool. And in principle, when you look at potential branches, you can work out umpteen different alternate trees. And when you look at some, there's a lot of things where things are like bouncing back and forth a lot in terms of character state. That's weird, especially if it's genetically implausible. If some things are ones that it's kind of difficult to get to a particular genetic switch, once it's done, it's done. And so it's more likely the ones where once it happens, then everything that is inheriting that is a more probable. So that you get this term parsimony as to how many switchings that you got to do. And ideally, the gut feeling is that the things with fewer switchings and that have more direct lineologies are more likely to be a viable one. And you enter in all the other data, the morphology data and the paleontological data. There's a whole bunch of stuff they enter into to be able to make informed judgments on that. And anybody who gets serious in the paleontology thing is going to be bumping into that stuff. So it's a nomenclature and a field that you want to get familiar with so that you can tell when creationists are bullshitting. Let's see what we got on. Oh yeah, people have had a little side confirmation on. BJ says they thought they found genes involved with speech in Neanderthal DNA. Yeah, they have found. I think FOXP2. I'm just going on my memory here on this one, Beej, but I think that one was discovered. Most of the genes they found are ones that relate to stuffing with the immune system and a lot of other things that are biologically and defensive related. But the one area that's interesting also is how much vocal range Neanderthals had, and their larynx is a little bit different than the Homo sapiens one. So there's some argument that some of the vowel forms that we could make, they probably couldn't. So they have a somewhat more limited acoustic range, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't have necessarily complicated grammar. If a paleoanthropologist could get in a time machine and go back, it'd be absolutely delightful, because then they could see how they were really doing stuff. If they buried their dead, which it does appear some did, were there any rituals involved? Did they have intonations? Were they dealing with visual things? We've now seen some instances of where Neanderthals are doing some very basic art things inside of caves. And in fact, maybe the Homo sapiens got the idea of painting inside of caves based on Neanderthals, and then kind of came up with even more ways of doing it. So the kind of idea is that there were feedback loops between the two species as they interacted for quite a long time in Europe in various spots, is one that they're still trying to nudge through. There are times when the same cave will eventually be occupied by Homo sapiens later on. Well, was there a turnover point? And was the turnover peaceful or not? Those are still things that are being looked at. But it looks like there was no major thrusty, spirit attacking conflict between human beings and Homo sapien and Homo neanderthalensis. For a while there, they were thinking maybe Neanderthals might be a subspecies of human, but that was a hard one to defend based on the morphology. If you look at, there's too much about the anatomy, particularly in the skull form, that just falls completely outside the human range. And this was even obvious whenever you would do movies where they would have to recreate somebody as a Neanderthal. To take a Neanderthal skull and make a model on a human to make it look like a Neanderthal. You can add the brow ridges and stuff, but there's shapes of the way that the skull is shifted and the human chin, which they didn't have, and all of that, you can't take away a chin. And so you get a kind of a bumpy version of a Neanderthal when you try to use a human underneath it. And that's because the skulls are fundamentally different in the shape, because the common ancestor goes back probably 800,000 years or more to any kind of split that was taking place there. So they've gone their own separate ways as close enough cousins that they can interbreed, but not identical species. So let's see what's going on over here. We're talking also about tool usage, obsidian. Obsidian, in fact, is another thing that you can use farther down the road when obsidian starts showing up as a tool item. You can tell from exactly what volcanic deposits they were using. And so you can tell how far away they were going. And that's another thing that relates to Neanderthals versus humans, is from this and the kind of shellfish they might have been eating or not, and the kinds of items used on tools and the way that they would be putting stuff together, you were gradually building up a network that it looks like human beings hunted farther and traded farther than Neanderthals did. It isn't that the Neanderthals didn't do it at all. It's that they were much more localized networks rather than human beings that are just wanderlust. And we tend to interconnect and trade stuff and trade ideas across extremely long ranges. With Homo sapiens, we get things where you'll find in a burial grave something that comes from thousands of miles away. That's the nearest thought. So it had to have been traded back and forth and back and forth. No, it doesn't necessarily mean one human hot-footed some obsidian from one spot to another, or a lapis lazuli or anything else. It's that there were trading networks where one thing trades to another, bartering, trading, and it ends up in some bigwig spot as part of his burial retinue. Yeah, Beach quite accurately points out Neanderthal art has got people excited. It's not as sophisticated as the stuff we find in the cave paintings of 20 and 30,000 years ago. The kind of perspective details and other things, but the apparently put your hand up and blow a pigment on it to display it. This is the equivalent of a signature. And we know that at least in the human cases, some of the hands are so small by comparison that it's very probable that some of the cave art was being done by women rather than just men. So there was an egalitarian element. There's a whole pile of detective work that's been pieced together on a lot of these things. But the Neanderthal art is very abstract. It's highly symbolic, probably. They use color splotches and gradated chevron lines and other things that may have had a symbolic content to them. They may have had a numerical content to it. The kinds of picture that looks like a picture, photographic style art, is apparently a later development. And how much of that is actually showing up, a little like a baby version of it is showing up in this Neanderthal art. And we don't yet have any counterpart examples of very basic versions in human art. So how much of this is passing back and forth? And there's an interesting debate. If you were to show an early Homo sapien and a Neanderthal, a sculpture of a horse, like something you'd find in the Confederate statues being taken down, the human would certainly recognize it as a horse. The question is, would a Neanderthal recognize it as a horse? It's not a big animal. It's a thing. It's a block of thing that has a, will they recognize that symbolic representation, especially if it's done in 2 dimensions? And we don't know. With the more and more art coming along, the impression is that maybe some equivalent of a Neanderthal Leonardo da Vinci might have recognized the horse as a horse. And to make that conceptual leap from an image to the object, the famous Magritte painting of a gentleman in a bowler hat. No, it's actually, I think it's just a pipe. And the caption says, "This is not a pipe."
Ceci n'est pas une pipe. Yeah.
Yeah, jump in. Yeah.
Oh, I was just saying the French. Ceci n'est pas une pipe.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know that Frenchy talk, you damn foreigner.
Well,
you get that, maybe.
Louisiana.
Yeah, there we go. Got that French stuff there. You know, and if we were talking with a Canadian, we'd be likely to get that too. You're bilingual, yeah. But yeah, it's a useful impression because of the difference between the representation of something and the object itself. You get into the same element in terms of maps. There's a whole philosophy of cartography about how accurate does a map need to be useful. And the absolute classic example of this is the London subway system. The genius who came up with the modern London subway map recognized that you don't need to have a map of the actual way the tracks go. You need to know where the stations are. So he regularized it into a simple geometric relationship where you've got a straight line that's going up. The track winds all over the place, but there's a straight line from one station to the other station to the other station, and the tracks come in as parallel lines so that you know if you need to get onto the red line, you need to go over here at this station to get on the one to get down to Ipswich. All of that is something which makes beautiful sense from that map. It's easy to use, but it's not a representation of the London subway system if you simply dug it all up and looked at the maze of tracks the way they fit across. But you don't need a map like that. So the inability to make a good relevant map of something is a higher level conceptual frame. The ability to abstract information and not lose the context of the information at the same time you're abstracting it, that's definitely a human trait. And it's an interesting question how far back in the hominid line it occurred. It wouldn't surprise me to see that Neanderthals can do elements of this. Less so for Homo erectus, but maybe a little bitty bit. And then when you go far the way back to Homo habilis and then into the Australopithecines, now you're so far down the road that the genetic systems that are eventually going to do them are probably in place, but they're not doing what we do now with them. Let's see what else we got over here. And
I think it's fair to say that all of that will go unnoticed by the creationists.
Yeah, except for the authority quotes. And that's why it's so fascinating. You can practically put an authority quote alert up on your brain whenever somebody writes something when you're reading the technical paper and you go, oh boy, I could see how a creationist could misquote that. Whoa. And $9 to Hominid on it, they will. Let me put a brief little pause in here for me to put up our commentary on our patrons and call attention to that. It takes me a while. Art, who still cannot manage to move my mouse around on the bloody screen conveniently to be able to get the menus up right. So it go through this every damn time. And I'm sorry. So there's my screen share. And we will talk about our RJ's patrons. And we got Stephen and Dyer and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Eric and Benjamin and Staggles and Alex Dotus Real and Everett and Paul. And I want to thank all of you. Here is my website. It was on the opening logo. I put links to it in the thing. If you don't have it bookmarked and a link to it on your smartphone, why the hell not? The work can't do a damn bit of good if you don't have the information there and you're not trading it and talking about it. I know Paulogia makes use of it. And Jackson, you have been picking my brain. Everybody can pick my brain. If you're on Twitter, you can tweet me and ask me any damn thing, or you can ask me questions at the TIP website. Then there's the Patreon site for these videos, although Patreon is slow as molasses on transferring the money. So I haven't got a hell of a lot of that. So for people who really want to do the fast track, please, the GoFundMe.com DCGo, which I put in bigger type so that everyone can see that. There is my shameless plug. And I would like to keep at the work in a way that can be productive. And it's sometimes tricky to do. Ink, paper, and books. Ideally, there are things where a new incoming information I'd like to actually acquire and process them and put them into the system. I'd like to eventually get to the stage, boy, that would require some scratch, to get the website up to the point where we can upgrade it to handle much more traffic and to be able to put video links and all this other kind of stuff in there. But I'm still running off of the freebie WordPress stuff, and I'm still a novice at that. So everybody that can support the project, please do so. I'm a retiree. This is my air quotes hobby, but in fact, it's my midlife crisis project because I'm doing stuff nobody's ever done before. If somebody hadn't started diving into this source methods analysis, it's done sporadically by a lot of different people. Jackson was bumping into it all on his own. That's how you were looking at things. Paul Ogio was doing that in his videos all on his own. I didn't have to teach him, but I hope that I've been doing a thing where I'm upping the ante. I'm increasing the focus, because instead of something that you come at to kind of sideways, source methods is where you should start. It's the killer. And then it allows you to put into context all of that larger stuff. So this is going to be an ongoing series. Where as I go through the book, each bit I'm going to be calling attention to how the content is adjusting, what sources are being discussed, what technical literature, as they start getting into the meatier chapter in this book, where they are supposedly discussing specific issues. I'm assuming that the number of technical papers being used for technical arguments are going to go up. But we'll see. If all they do it is a pile of authority quoting and nicking out of context, then they run into what I call the Dracula rule. I was talking to this with Jackson earlier. It's the thing I use to describe the pitfall of the sloppy scholar, that Dracula can't come into the house unless you ask him. But once you ask him in, he can come in anytime you want. And so the scholarly equivalent of this is, if you don't know about the Schmidlap paper, you can be accused of ignorance, but you can't be held accountable for the content of the Schmidlap paper. But if you cite the Schmidlap paper on anything at all, for an authority quote, or for that the sun rises in the east, it doesn't matter what. Now you've opened the door, and every bit of the Schmidlap paper is open access knowledge that you should have known everything in it. And if there's stuff in there that's contradicting your argument, like the E.D. and Johansen stuff on the chimpanzees, or the fact that the chimpanzee teeth were logical to preserve and were very specifically diagnostic of chimpanzees, that they're not mentioning in their little quick flyby, then that's an indication of sloppy scholarship. And what I'm going to be measuring at the source level is, can they ever really work out what they think happened? That's the goal of the book. It's not, can we poke holes in the evolution argument with a bunch of authority quotes? Can we really address the data? Do we understand what the data is? Since they're young earth creationists, Sanford is, do they explain things in terms of the flood? The reason why we would have all of these fossils, presumably, is because they were deposited in flood deposits. Or were they? Well, I don't know. If they don't tell us, then they don't know. And in which case, they don't have the honesty of their own position. An idea worth having is one worth defending. And so I at least give props to somebody who is a young earth creationist who has the gumption to actually come up and defend it. Find a dandy, do it. But don't pretend to do it. Don't do it by poking at the opposition. Same thing with the intelligent designers. Gunter Beckley, the in-house paleontologist, apparently got religion recently, and now he's their go-to guy now that Casey Luskin has disappeared. And Beckley, at least, is a paleontologist. He does stuff on insect systematics. And what's fascinating is he never has discussed insects. In all the postings, every single one that he's put up at the Discovery Institute, it's all on human evolution. And it's all trying to poke holes in the evolutionary argument. I think I mentioned it in one of the earlier evolution hours. I had a thing on Beckley. It may have been the one that got shunted onto my wrong channel. I'll have to get that moved back. But anyway, he never explains what he thinks happened.
So what you're saying is he avoids his own area of expertise, like how Georgia avoids genetics?
Yeah,
Oh,
isn't that peculiar?
Very strange.
Why is it that the insect paleontologist isn't talking about insects? Why is he going after human evolution? Why? It's obvious why. Because humans have got to be special. The one leitmotif that runs through all anti-evolution apologetics is, we are made in God's image. We are specially created, preferably in Adam and Eve, and maybe Noah's Ark too, afterwards. And therefore, we did not evolve from some lower form. We are not an animal. We are not a mammal. We are not an animal of any kind. We are humans, specially created. And it just goes at their sense of self-esteem. This was the problem who couldn't accept evolution in Darwin's day, and it's the same one now. Whether or not they focus on human evolution, that's the little eye twitch that's always going on in the background. And so they don't really care about trilobites. They really care about human beings. Well, Sanford and bunch at least are honest about it. They're diving right in on the thing that really bothers them, the idea that there's a progression of proto-humans that get to be more human-y and less proto as you move forward millions and millions of years. And do we have every single blip in the scope, every shift and blip? No, we don't have that, and may never have that. The animals lived in environments that are hard to preserve in many cases, but particularly if there were early stages in the primates where they're living in jungles and they're acidics, and so boop, you get teeth, and that's about it. The vast majority of primates are known from that. And then later on, they start diversifying into new habitats, and by the luck of the draw, you get occasionally a good skeleton. Even Lucy is only like 40 or 50% complete, but you can mirror image stuff. I mean, if you've got a vertebrae on one side, there's going to be a match on the other side, you know, so you can reconstruct the vast majority of the thing that way. And some things are more diagnostic than others. Hip bones, pelvises and things tell you about bipedality, the location of the foramen magnum in the skull, which means you need to have the back end of the skull to see some of these things.
Oh, yeah.
Endocasts, yeah, all of that stuff. It depends on which piece you get. If you don't get that piece, you got a question mark.
The papers on Acediba, the paper by Minton and DeWitt and the other guy, they were talking about, they were the first, or they were the only of the papers cited on, you know, talking about Wood's Acediba conclusion that actually addressed postcranial morphology. And if I remember correctly, they didn't actually look at the hips. I don't remember if they actually talked about the hips.
Yeah, I don't think they did either. And the very fact that there are lots of things about leg proportion and other things that can relate to bipedality, and there's a whole bunch of things in terms of stress analysis. There's a huge amount of science literature that goes on this. For those of you who like the human evolution issue, don't forget Planet of the Apes, Chapter 5 of the old tip. That's at my website. Everybody can download that. It's about the size of a book. And I went through and analyzed how many anti-evolutionists, and this was about 2003 or 4 when I was writing at that stage, how many anti-evolutionists even bothered to mention the foramen magnum and the pelvis alignments and all of that stuff? And it turns out virtually none of them. And so what we're seeing in the Acediba example that Jackson is talking into, 15 years later, they're still making the same myopic mistakes. They're avoiding the same data field. That there are things that they can't quite wrap their brain around something that was settled in paleoanthropology 20, 30 years ago. And that was which came first, big brains or bipedality? And this was a hot ticket item back in the early 20th century when they were arguing. And the reason why the Piltdown hoax was accepted for so long is because it fed into the mythology that the big brain came first. Well, it turns out bipedality did, and not merely in a single lineage. Bipedality among these African primates was popping up in a whole bunch of different lineages. And some of them, they were still tree climbers. They could run along the top of the limbs. They're not huge animals. They're 2 or 3 feet high, in some cases a little bit bigger. And they can get down on the ground. Going up into trees is a specialized thing, and you have to be very wary about it because a lot of your predators can get up into trees too. I think leopards like to hide their prey. Once they capture them, they drag them up into a tree so nobody else can get at it, the damned hyenas. You want to do things safely. So trees are not necessarily a place of refuge, but they are a natural habitat, especially to find ripening fruit and various other things that you go into. And so the fact that the human lineage relates even down to the fact of the I hate broccoli gene, that the natural primate receptor has a bitter taste when you eat green vegetables, and it triggers off when you eat rancid fruit and all that kind of stuff. So it's got a blech quality. And that same gene then can be kicked off in us mutants, and about half of the human species has deactivated that gene, and you can tell with very great accuracy who has them because it depends on whether the kids like to eat broccoli as a kid or not, or will they eat it as an adult. So when George Bush declared how he couldn't stand broccoli, he's got the normal primate gene. Otherwise, he'd like broccoli. I can eat broccoli, and I have no problem with that. So I at least have one of the new alleles, and I may even have both. I can't remember whether, I know I was eating onions when I was a kid, but I wasn't all that fond of broccoli as a child. So I might have just one of the alleles. And so there's where our biology, stemming back millions of years, has an effect as to what you find in the frozen food section in your grocery store.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. I remember reading about that a year or two ago how, you know, we have our taste receptors, and we don't like bitter things, and of course bitter things are poisonous in nature, so haha. Makes perfect
and
sense.
that's it's perfectly understandable where we get these things from. Yeah, Idle says that they love broccoli, so it must be missing that gene, and that, yeah, that's exactly the case. That they can take kids and do haplotypes on them, and they can predict with remarkable accuracy just exactly whether they have the gene turned on or off or not by what the face they make at broccoli. So I call it the I hate broccoli gene. I can't remember what particular little and I think it's a single point mutation. I don't know whether it's a single nucleotide or whether it's just a single amino acid that makes some of the thing that turns it off, that puts up the coding that says whoop, deactivate. And so there's another issue. You know, your creationists would say, well, that's the loss of information. That's part of the fall or something. But it's still natural variation. And in fact, one of the things that I think related to us becoming fully human had to do with turning off some of the old primate dynamics. One of the things involves the inability to a long-term plan. And if you give, I think they've been doing for a lot of primates, they've done this study. You have 2 bowls of M&Ms, and apparently primates love M&Ms just as much as humans do. And if you have a thing where you have some with just a few M&Ms and another bowl with a lot, and the rule of the game is whatever you grab for first is going to go to your opponent. If you put the bowls out, the instinct of the orangutan is to grab the one with the most. Mine, mine, mine. Ooh, I like them. I'm going to grab the big one. So the moment they do that, it goes to the other orangutan. And this will happen automatically. They can't get the gist of it unless you replace them with symbols. If you put the symbol representing the number of the ones, and they're able to understand some basic number symbology in terms of the depiction of them, to where they can step back and they're no longer physically seeing the object, but a representation of it, they can get the game, and they can realize that if they pick the one with the low number, they'll get the one with the big amount. And they can do it then. But if you then go back to the physical jelly beans or M&Ms, they'll go right back to grabbing the thing. It'll just override. So it's entirely possible that in the primate lineage, there was a thing that shut down that override bit to where they're able to kind of look at things symbolically better and make more Machiavellian calculations. And that's part of the thing that led off to some of the behavior that we do now. So there's some food for thought, some M&Ms for thought. So we're just about nearing the end of the thing. We should probably getting some nice side comments from the peanut gallery there as to what we're thinking about the show. Pug, what have you been thinking of today's show? Is Pug there?
Sorry for the delay there. You'll have to forgive me. I'm doing a little soldering while we're doing this. My apologies.
Oh, you're building another Tesla coil?
It's like he knows me. This is. Yeah.
You're just in a Tesla mode there. You know, if you start building a teleporter, let me know.
Well, I had to follow the chain. We did the spark gaps, Andy and I. Now I'm onto the solid states, and that's proving a lot more complicated. Anyway, I learn something every time I hang around with you. You know that? I did, however.
We try. I learned tons of stuff from Jackson. He knows he's a terrible influence on me because every paper that I vet for the text for his videos and that is the whole slew of technical sources I didn't know about in there. Brian just pointed out the broccoli gene is TAS 2R38 variant. Ta-da! Yeah, I knew it around there somewhere. Well, somebody will know something.
I learn a lot from you too. Every time we talk, I also learn stuff. So there you go.
I did not mean to slight Jackson. I also find it every interaction with Jackson.
Yeah, well, that's the wonderful thing is that we can interact in ways and synergize. We can draw off of and expand, and it also saves us time because the idea that instead of everybody having to research everything on their own, people that are really good that have the burr on the bonnet to go through and research a particular topic can do it, and then we can observe their observations. We can fact check them because they'll put the sources up, and we can confirm they're reliable sources, and that will leg us up because we don't have to spend the time to research everything everybody else does.
Proto-Avis.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah. I was happy to help you on that one. You know, it's just, why should you have to hunt around for this obscure report where I go, oh, that's the Proto-Avis case. I covered that in TIP.
Yeah, yeah. I actually was dealing with another creationist just the other day. I think it was the same day we talked about Jensen saying that transitional fossils do exist. That some creationist was saying Proto-Avis was a hoax. It's like, well, no. First of all, it wasn't a hoax. So I had to explain that whole bit to him. Fortunately, I had you to help me with all that information.
Yeah. And you know, every one of those blips is an indicator of their source method. Where would they get Proto-Avis from? But from some creationist apologetic. Same way when they'll say, oh, the hoaxes. What hoaxes? Well, Piltdown and Nebraska Man. Uh-oh. They're reading creationist literature because that's where you get it from. There's certain things that are diagnostic. Another area, when you get into really knee deep, when you're looking at primary sources, sometimes the exact quote is what does them. There was this Islamic creationist, Dawa, who I joust with on Twitter. Anybody who follows me on Twitter can see these things. And he's just a complete doofus. And he's a secondary source addict. He trawls all sorts of oddball stuff. Some of it's from Islamic creationist literature, but other stuff from the intelligent design literature that he may have gotten secondarily from somebody like Harun. It's hard to tell. But at any rate.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, because almost all of modern Harun Yahya is siphoning off the intelligent design literature, and it's just slavishly so. So some of this stuff may be riffed off because there were some. He started talking about information theory, and he lobbed these two scientists at me, William A. and J. Wells. And then he puts a few more, and I suddenly realized, oh, he was referring to William A. Dembski, and Jonathan Wells. And this was from one of their things. Ironically, when I did a text, he typed out this source very precisely. He copies really tightly. So I copied his copy, and I did a Google search on it, and that's where I found the article by Dembski and Wells, where those two scientists in exactly that reference had popped up. So I now pretty much identified where he got it from or where he stole it from, got it from. And of course, Dembski and Wells have access to grind. They're both terribly incompetent scholars. They're manipulative as all get out. So you can't trust them as a secondary source, but that's exactly what this guy was doing. Worse, Dembski and Wells are Christians. Jonathan Wells is a Mooney. He's a Unification Church minister. And so they're totally opposed to Islamic version of reality where they don't accept Jesus Christ. And so here he's trawling in a worldview that's antithetical to his worldview, but he doesn't know it because he's too far away from the source material. It's just hilarious.
Yeah. The series that I kind of started out my channel critiquing, the Evolutionist series, that was actually done. I eventually found out by an Islamic guy, but he was taking information, arguments from creationists and intelligent designers. Yeah. So that makes total sense.
Yeah, a smorgasborder. That's very common on there. And because there's relatively little direct creationist stuff from the Islamic worldview. The stuff that does pop up is just pathetically lame. They'll look at some little phrase from the Quran. They're like people defending the Book of Mormon. They'll find some cockamamie reference to something and figure that they can get the hydrological cycle or the pumping of the blood from it, you know, and it's just tendentious as all get out. And there's a local Islamic group that had a pamphlet out, one of their little things that was exactly that way. I mean, a sweet guy, friendly fellow. He's kind of a modern, air quotes, liberal Muslim, but he still has this notion that the Quran has got to be perfect, and therefore it's got to connect up with science because science is real, and so they have to find linkages to it to reinforce that. And it's the same urge you get into with the Glee Club ones that wave Isaac Newton at us and talk about the great Christian scientists that made science, and all of these nasty Darwinists are causing there to be science is breaking down because of it. You get all sorts of this apologetics.
I love when they tell us that Christianity or Christians actually invented science. It's like, hello, Thales.
There's a grain, but there's a grain of truth to it. And here it's the fun part. It's that the science we know, the modern experimental method science, did originate in the Christian worldview. It didn't happen in China. It didn't happen in the Islamic world. It almost happened in China. And the interesting thing is finding out why. Plus, it didn't happen in most of Christendom. that the Byzantines didn't show some tremendous urge for Galileo-type thinkers. No, they didn't at all. The vast majority of Christians didn't do that. But there were elements of Christian thinking that opened a doorway to an experimentalist approach. One of them is that, unlike the Taoists in China, who were the ones that were doing the kind of proto-science, they didn't think you could tear nature apart and look at the pieces. Whereas in the Western context, they were used to building cathedrals. And it was a communal effort, and they easily could envisage God as a craftsman, a draftsman, an architect who draws the plan out, who puts the things in place and builds things. And so you can look at the pieces and marvel at the pieces and see God's handiwork that way. That's a very different attitude from the Taoists. That was part of the trick. Then the other was the final innovation of experimentalism. And it started up in the Catholic world. You know, Galileo came from that environment. And it was the momentous thing where you would think that, well, put it to the test. Don't take things on authority anymore. That was one of the reasons why the Romans probably never would have developed science as we know it, because they were way too addicted to authorities. They were just the same way as the medieval church was. But it really jump-started in the Protestant world, where people started doing their own thinking even more and more and more. And so it reached the stage that by the time you hit the Industrial Revolution, the Catholic world is starting to become a siding, because they're no longer able to keep up, because too much of the stuff, there was a time when the church decreed vacuums couldn't exist. And even if you demonstrated a vacuum in front of them, they wouldn't allow it to exist. You know, this is not conducive to thinking. So gradually, it isn't as though all science stopped in the Catholic world, but if you really wanted to be at the cutting edge, you went to Amsterdam or London or somewhere like that, and or later on in Paris. And then it gets caught up in politics. By the time you get into the 18th century, now you got the French Revolution. And now you get a thing where an awful lot of people were opposed to the new geology, because some of the new geologists were from that French bunch over there on the other side that were chopping people's heads off. So you had this opposition to it, that they were trying to upturn everything. And so it had the same pathology of worry in the time of Jefferson over how that if you were going to accept the new science, you were somehow a Jacobin, and we're going to go for guillotines and get rid of monarchies. And the same kind of panic hits in the early 20th century, when you've got Marxism, you've got modernism, you've got Einstein, Sir Oliver Lodge, I think, who was a very conservative physicist who lost his kid in World War I, wrote a nasty little diatribe about Einstein, the Bolsheviki of science. And he was opposing it because of all of these revolutions that are going on, tired of revolutions. And then the same thing happens then later on with the communists in the 1920s and 30s and all the rest, where you get things where things become continuously politicized. And you find it even today, where ironically, some perfectly decent science is actually still being done in Iran. They still teach evolution in their schools. Not so in Saudi Arabia, where they think the earth is flat. So geocentrism. So it's a fascinating thing to see how politics is inevitably part of the thing, part of the big debate between Gould and Dawkins and stuff back in the 1970s was partly a proxy war over very left-wing scientists versus very conservative scientists. And so politics was entering into the fray. You can never quite get past that, except the science eventually settles out, and people who didn't have anything to do with the political squabble can now look at the data and figure, well, one side had their head up their ass, or maybe both sides had their head up their ass, and neither one of them had the thing right, and we have to come up with something fresh, which is kind of what happened with the lunar formation. Both of the main theories for the formation of the moon were wrong. It wasn't a captured satellite, and it wasn't formed in a single accretion disk. It was carved from a collision event, which took a long time for people to figure out. The arguments between on bird evolution, the arboreal up in trees and drop to fly versus the cursorial runner and flap, 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 take into the air models, polarized everybody for a long time. And it was actually something that was a mix of both. The animals can do both. And the same thing with the single species model versus the multi-regional model, that now we realize that in fact there was an awful lot of gene mixing and multiple populations that were coexisting and all of that. So in a way, both sides were right and both sides were wrong. That happens an awful lot in science. But what's fun will be to see, oh, in fact, I was going to put up a thing I was going to do a thing on the Edion Johansen thing. I forgot to mention it because it got sidetracked. I put the link up to it. One of the quotes that this new book puts up is an authority quote from Edion Johansen yeah, I think it's EDO and Chance. I got the link up for it. It's a quote mine. It's right at the tail end of the quote mine thing at Talk Origins, and they use that short version of the thing, and it's about punctuated equilibrium issue. It's not about human evolution at all, and they're treating it as if it was when they're talking about, well, this form of Darwinism turned out not to be confirmed. And they never explained what it was that they were talking about there. Well, when you read the quote mine thing, you discovered that they were talking about that. So what I'm seeing in this new Sanford book is just a train wreck of authority quoting. And I'll be measuring precisely exactly how much primary source data they discuss and in what context and how much they leave out. And those are going to be the things that we're going in on further shows. So we're a little bit past the hour on that. I would like to thank everybody for having shown up on the Today Show. And let me do a little last minute thing here. My cute little badge that I'll put up to shut down the broadcast if this thing will open up in a hurry. And then I'll do a screen share. And come. Where are we? Oh, why is things so difficult happen when I don't want them to be slow? Well, too bad. BJ, the statement that some Africans evolved from another hominin than us. No. They may be the current debate that they're finding that the human species has, in fact, ranged much more widely than in Africa than was thought. It's not just down in the southern part. They're finding fossils up in the northern area, Sahara and that range. And so the idea that the species is a much more complex history, but it still doesn't change the haplotypes and other stuff. That for all practical purposes, all human beings on Earth come from African stock, and that there were maybe multiple pulses of out of Africa, and of course then some of them that hit the Middle East then started boinking and interbreeding with the, oh, there we go, I finally got my thing up. It took forever. Let me reshare, put that up, since Peter had done such a wonderful job on this, and there we go. And this is cute little logo that he did for Troubles in Paradise and my tip project, Methodology of Creationism. We'll be shutting down here in a moment. I urge everybody to check out my website to get the material in there. There's a lot of stuff. Admittedly, things have moved on since 2000 and something when I wrote a lot of this material, but there's a lot of it effectively that hasn't changed at all. And it gives you a chance at your leisure to read the various stuff that's up there and get caught up on a lot of the character things. And also everybody can ask questions. They can put comments in. You can, at the website, you can even see where I've been jousting with Creationists, and you can see how I do. I apply the tip method at all stages on all subject matter. Everything can be approached as a source methods thing, and it will always improve your thinking to rely upon primary sources whenever possible and try to find out what the data are before you shoot your mouth off, and to learn what the facts are and try to make sense of all the data. That's standard reasoning. And with that, we will close down our broadcast today and thank everybody for hopefully is an entertaining show.